Thank you so much, Mr. Amitabh Kant, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, he's been the G20 Sherpa, plays a very, very important role as far as G20 is concerned. And today's theme, sir, is about reforming G20 and leading the global south. After last year's experience where India was leading the G20, how has the experience been this year in Brazil? And there was, of course, the Delhi Declaration. How has the last year been in terms of setting the goals for other countries and other members of the G20?
First of all, let me say that India's G20 was very unprecedented and historic. It was historic because India made it from G20 to G21 by including African Union as a member. Secondly, our declaration was very ambitious, very progressive, very forward-looking, and it was widely appreciated by all the leaders of G20. And thirdly, we did it very differently from any other country by taking it all over to every state and union territory of India and making it a mass movement. The Brazilian presidency has just got over, and I would say that as a member of the Troika, India assisted and supported them. Frankly speaking, I would say that it lacked ambition. Their only ambition was to have an alliance on hunger and poverty, which they managed to achieve, and India supported them in that. But I think there could have been much greater ambition towards climate, towards energy transition, towards growth, strong sustainable growth, which is very critical. These are critical because global growth is at its lowest right now, at about 3%, lowest since the turn of the century. And while the developed world is growing at 1.8%, the global south, lower and middle income countries are growing at 4.4%. And this is going to be the story for the next 3 decades, according to IMF and World Bank, that emerging markets will grow at a much faster pace because of young demographics. The population in India, Asia, Africa will be very young, whereas the population across Europe and America will be aging. And therefore, these countries will grow at a much, much higher pace. And that is very critical. And the second point, which is very important, is the global debt. The global debt is very, very high. If you look at the global south, there are 15 countries which spend more on debt than on education. There are 44 countries which spend more on debt, on their interest payment on debt. The interest payment is higher than what they spend on health. And therefore, there is a need for greater debt transparency, and there's a need for debt restructuring of the global south.
Right.
And those are issues which should be brought center stage,
right,
which we hope to do in South Africa now.
Absolutely. How much more difficult is it to arrive at a consensus on a global platform such as this in today's world, given that, we had at the time of the Delhi Declaration, the Middle East crisis was not there, the world literally standing divided. Is it far more challenging in today's world to arrive at a consensus in that context?
So there are many challenges. First and foremost, we must understand there is a global challenge of a crisis in the heart of Europe. There is a raging war for over 3 years now in the heart of Europe. We should also be very clear that World War I was fought in Europe, the World War II was fought in Europe, and we have this war going on for 3.5 years. You have a huge humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. More people have died in the Middle East in 1 year than what they've died in the Russia-Ukraine crisis over 3.5 years. So you have a Middle East crisis. And then you have a challenge now in Syria. So you have all these challenges.
Right.
Secondly, you have a very major challenge in terms of global value chains having broken. So you've seen United States putting 100% duty on Chinese automobiles, 50% duty on batteries, etc. And Europe has also moved forward and put a 45% duty on imports from China on automobiles. And this duty is being put because they say that China is overproducing for the world and is supported, their production is based on support by the government subsidizes their production, and therefore they are producing below market costs. And what you will see is more trade wars. So that is the second crisis. And the third crisis, to my mind, is the crisis of new productive forces of artificial intelligence, generative AI, quantum computing. These have the opportunity to enhance production, productivity, transform lives of citizens in education, health, nutrition, many areas. But they also have the potential to trigger conflict among societies. And therefore you need international regulation so that they can grow in a manner that these new technologies benefit humanity and benefit society.
Right. You spoke about this very important issue of tariffs, and with Trump coming in, there's a lot of rhetoric surrounding that. How is India, poised to look at this in terms of opportunities and challenges? Because right now the focus appears to be China. Is India in a more advantageous position, would you say?
I think India is in a hugely advantageous position because we should really try and take full advantage of this, because irrespective of changes of government, there is a belief that it's a very significant belief that India has to work with the United States and the United States has to work with India. And that gets reflected in the fact that we have a partnership in the Quad, and we are doing many things together in climate, in energy transition, in critical materials, and you saw this agreement on critical minerals, and then we had the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, IMEC, which was done during G20. So many areas, including Biofuel Alliance. All these are key areas where India is working with the United States. Also, it's important to understand that there is only one country in the world which has retained its market share at about 26% of the global GDP for the last 3 decades. Governments may come, governments may go, but United States has retained its market share at 26% of the global GDP. It has a 44% market capitalization of the world with just 4% of the population. And it's the only country. Europe's share has fallen from 30% to 18%, but America has retained it. It's also important for us to understand that countries like Japan, which grew from post-World War II, Korea, recent time China, all have grown at high rates on the back of penetrating United States as far as exports are concerned. And therefore this relationship, to my mind, is very critical for India to be able to grow into a fully developed economy and becoming a Viksit Bharat by 2047.
Right. Also, some of the questions around India's neighborhood as well. We are one of the countries that has extended to Sri Lanka, a $1 billion line of credit, with China also trying to woo a number of countries in this entire hemisphere. What really are the challenges for India in that context, even as it tries to lead the global south?
So the biggest challenge for the world is the global debt crisis. As I said, that the global south is spending 2.4% of their GDP on just meeting the interest payment. That is more than what they spend on climate. They spend 2.1% on climate, and they spend 2.4% on interest payment. That is why, the interest payment just look at this, interest payment on debt is higher than what they spend on health in 44 countries of the global south. And therefore, there needs to be a debt transparency. There needs to be a restructuring of debt, and that's critical because China has extended debt to many countries of the global south where there is a lack of transparency, and there is a need for a plan by IMF for all these global south countries so that the debt is there is a clarity on transparency, there is a clarity on sustainability, and there is a structured plan of action which will really come out within a period of next 6 to 7 months. Otherwise, it'll have a huge implication on the growth and progress of these countries.
Right. India has also, sir, recently rejected a $300 billion climate finance package for the Global South as the COP29 presidency is concerned. India has come out and said that the various bodies of the United Nations which have forced it down without hearing their side. What exactly are the apprehensions here? And what are the implications of this?
So the COP29, the negotiation process was very badly managed, to my mind, by UNFCCC. Number one. Number two, I really feel that the basic principle is what was agreed to at COP21 in Paris, which was based on common but differentiated responsibilities. That 82% of the total carbon space in the world has already been occupied by the developed world. There's very little left for developing countries like India and the Global South. Now, they've taken away all the carbon space and they're still doing greenhouse gas emission. And they want to achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050 without providing either the finance, technology or capacity building which was agreed to at COP21 in Paris. So they're changing the goalpost. And that is why agreeing only to $300 billion, whereas what they should support for 1.3 trillion. What is agreed to in G20 is that the world will move from billions to trillions. The package was 1.3. They brought it down to 300 billion and it did not have, and they said it will not be 300 billion was also not be provided by the states, but it will be provided through private and multilateral sources. So there was a total denial, there was a total back out from what was agreed to at COP21, and I think it was the worst possible deal, and that's why India did not agree to it.
But where do you see the roadmap ahead on this? Because there's been so much of back and forth on this issue for years on end. Where do you see this headed?
So I think no deal is better than a bad deal as far as climate is concerned, and India took the right stand, to my mind.
Right. Also, as far as India's neighborhood, another question, as far as the BIMSTEC itself is concerned, under the Sheikh Hasina government until recently, India was in touch with, neighboring countries such as Bangladesh over economic and technical cooperation. Do initiatives such as this now hang in the balance with the change of regime in Bangladesh, would you say?
No, see, one must realize that we are in a complex world. We are in a world where there will be constant changes of government. I mean, you've seen this happening in the United States, you've seen this happening in several parts of Europe, you've seen this raging war in Europe, you'll see this in our neighborhood constantly. But we should be absolutely clear about our national goal, our national perspective. Our goal is clearly that we need to move from being a $4 trillion economy to a $30 trillion economy by 2047. The challenge for India is that if you have to move from being a $4 trillion to a $30 trillion economy, that means your GDP has to grow nine times. Your per capita income has to grow 8 times. Your manufacturing has to grow about almost 16 times. That is the challenge. Your per capita income has to be taken from $3,000 to about $18,000. That's our challenge. So irrespective of the global challenges, we need to grow and expand. And we are fortunate that we are a large country. We have a big domestic demand. That is what we need to pursue.
Right. Even as the Prime Minister, has recently visited Guyana, met with leaders of various Caribbean countries, after 50 years that the Prime Minister has actually been there, and that's also an area where there's a huge amount of diaspora of the Indian populations present over there. What do you see as a significance of India reaching out to all of these countries, in its bid to lead the Global South? So,
the Global South is critical. Why I'm saying this is that, IMF has said that three-fourths of the growth for the next 3 decades will come from emerging markets. And if three-fourths of the growth is going to come from emerging markets, particularly Africa, because the population again is very young in Africa and African countries are going to grow rapidly. So India needs to work in very close relationship with Africa, build up global value chains with Africa, export to Africa, build up a very close, tight relationship on many aspects with Africa.
Right. And what are the opportunities that you expect, as far as South Africa is concerned, the opportunities that were perhaps missed in Brazil? How do you look at the future of the G20?
No, I think the opportunities are in terms of our own growth, our ability to do structural transformation in our own economy, to move from being an agricultural economy to a major industrial economy, and then getting into cutting edge areas of growth. So you have to get into electric vehicles, you have to get into battery storage, you have to get into green hydrogen, you have to get into a rapid expansion of being both a digital power and a green energy power. India has to become the most advanced country as far as digitization and as far as greening its economy is concerned. It must be the first country in the world to industrialize and urbanize through a process of decarbonization. That is critical for India.
And how do you see that happening?
And if that happens, which many of our companies are doing, and that's what the government is pushing for. We've done 200 gigawatt of renewables. We've demonstrated our great ability to move towards green hydrogen, be a low-cost producer. The more India does this, gets into these areas, we'll not only be producing for our own requirement, but we'll become a major exporter to the world. Our ambition is that by 2047, we should move away from being a producer of just fossil fuel to a producer of green hydrogen. India is climatically blessed. Our challenge is that by 2047, we should be the biggest producer of green hydrogen and the largest exporter of green hydrogen in its liquid form, ammonia, and bring down the price from $4.5 to $1 per kilogram. Now, that's the challenge for India.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Amitabh Kant, for joining us and sharing with us your perspective on G20 and India's roadmap ahead. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great pleasure.